Right. All right. And with that, hello everyone. Welcome to the Cannabis and Mental Health and Get Sensible collaboration Ask the Expert event. Today we're going to be talking about some kind of heavy stuff, but some really, really valuable conversations. We've got some great folks on the meeting today. So we're going to be talking today about sort of the difference between a bad trip, maybe negative substance use experience, and a psychosis episode, and discussing the similarities, differences, and responses either way. To kind of get started, I'll introduce myself. My name is Hunter. I work on the Get Sensible project. My pronouns are they, he, she. I am a drug policy person and harm reductionist that is located in Treaty 7 in Alberta. Move to the next slide. So just to start off, we'll do a little introduction to the projects that we have involved in the talk tonight. Then we'll move into a bit of a land acknowledgement, an introduction to all of our panelists, and then we'll get into the discussion. The last 15 minutes of the talk will be dedicated to questions. So as questions come up, please feel free to put them into the chat, and we will discuss at the end. Just like a small warning, there will be some conversations around psychosis, some negative experiences within the mental health systems and with substance use. And so if at any point you are feeling a bit flooded or overwhelmed by that, please absolutely do take the time that you need. And yeah, and with that, I'll introduce the Get Sensible project first, I suppose. So Get Sensible is a project that is sort of an offshoot of the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. In response to legalization, Get Sensible created a suite of resources, basically for youth and their allies discussing cannabis and risks and behaviors and all of these things. As that has continued to evolve, the workbooks and toolkits that Get Sensible has created have been updated as the conversation has changed. Get Sensible also has a suite of other cannabis harm reduction and also just like youth ally related materials. All of Get Sensible's suite of resources are available for PDF download on our website, and links to all of that stuff will be distributed to everyone in a PDF format at the end, and also available on social media. So I'll pass it off to somebody to introduce cannabis and mental health.
Thanks, Hunter. Hi, everyone. My name's Carmen. I'm the Youth Engagement Advisor with Cannabis Mental Health. And just a very brief kind of overview of the project. We're a national youth-led initiative that develops and disseminates targeted evidence-based cannabis education with and for youth. Understanding that abstinence-based cannabis education does not work for everyone, our project is rooted in harm reduction and anti-oppressive frameworks. We deliver, kind of similar to Get Sensible, a suite of resources, including a free certificate course where young people can learn about the relationship between cannabis mental health, understand the changing historical, legal context of cannabis, and also explore harm reduction approaches, as well as reflect on their own and other voices of lived and living experiences. So I will pass it back to Hunter now to proceed onward. Hunter, let me know if you want help introducing the land acknowledgement at all.
Amazing. So we have I'll just give a little intro. So all of us are located at different areas throughout the unceded territories of Canada, as it is colonially known. And so prior to having any of these really important discussions around mental health, I think it's really, really important to discuss the ongoing mental health effects of colonialism for everyone, but specifically Indigenous people within Turtle Island. And so before we proceed, we've got a land acknowledgement that was recorded by a member of the Cannabis and Mental Health team. And so we will play that now.
land acknowledgement is a formal territorial acknowledgement through which we recognize the Indigenous peoples of Canada as the original custodians of the lands on Turtle Island, which was appropriated by European settlers during colonization. We must understand that there is no one right way to acknowledge the land. However, it is our responsibility to understand our positionality and privilege as settlers to become better allies.
Ani bojo, Nimkins Indigenous Oki Kendan Donjaba Benishin Dondem Anishna Beninindao. My name is Connor Little Thunder Spirit Lafortune. I'm from Dokis First Nation and I am part of the Bird Clan. As an Indigenous person, I have an inherent responsibility to honor and respect the earth. I understand that due to the nature of this national project, we are not all on the same territories.
I therefore acknowledge that the lands upon which we all reside and benefit from are called Turtle Island, where hundreds of nations, customs, languages, and practices live. I acknowledge and honor Shkogmakwe, Aki, Nebe, Shkode, Awisin, and Anikobjigan. These lands have been utilized and taken care of for millennia. I acknowledge and thank all of those who have worked these lands and continue to do so in order to give me a place to reside, work, and receive schooling. I acknowledge my responsibility as a tribal and treaty member on these territories, and the responsibility of all of my relation. I acknowledge my non-Indigenous brothers, sisters, and siblings who have found their home on these sacred lands. I follow the intents stated in the Dish with One Spoon Treaty and the Treaty of Niagara to share these lands and collectively play our part in caring for her. Miigwech.
A land acknowledgement is a first step. As settlers on this land, we are all treaty signers and occupiers of unceded territories, who often benefit to this day from the structures and practices of colonialism, and are therefore responsible and accountable for the violence that Indigenous people face. Allyship is a continuous process, one you earn from the communities you stand in solidarity with through your actions and commitment. We can recommit to being better allies through continuous efforts in the Truths to Reconciliation process of the Indigenous people's history. And we can stand in solidarity with them, which should begin by listening to the various Indigenous voices and their efforts in indigenizing their lands, communities, and history.
Thank you, everyone. So before we step into introducing our panelists, just a few reminders. I touched on this a little bit at the beginning. Feel free to type any questions that you have into the chat. We've got a couple folks that are going to be moderating and making sure that all your questions get recorded so that we can address them at the end. The chat will also be a spot where there will be relevant resources and conversations throughout the conversation. So please keep your eye on the chat for links and whatnot. If you have any additional questions as well, feel free to reach out to Cannabis and Mental Health over email at Michaela@cannabisandmentalhealth.ca. And yeah, again, just a little trigger warning. This conversation will include some depictions of psychosis episodes as well as some negative experiences with substance use. And again, feel free to engage with that as it feels safe in your body, and taking breaks and shutting off your camera as needed is absolutely encouraged. And yeah, with that also, our conversations around psychosis and substance use can be sensitive and for both our people that are listening and also our panelists. So any conversations or questions that are inappropriate or panelists are feeling uncomfortable with, we do not need to be answered. And so for panelists as well, if anything is feeling a little bit too much, then absolutely you are completely within your rights to just skip the question, and we will move on to something that feels better. And so yeah, just with that as our ground rules, I think that that's about everything. The resources also, there is a PDF compiled, and all of those information that will be sent out to everybody in email as well. And then yeah, with that, we can probably close the slides and we can just move into some introductions. Wonderful. And so I've already introduced myself, but the question that I wanted to use to ground our conversation and kind of get everybody comfortable with each other is for our panelists. And so we can start out. And that question is, what does mental health and harm reduction mean to you? And I'm just so excited to hear what everybody has to say. So I think that we can start off. Why don't we hear from our youth panelists? So Elsa, if you would like to start off for us, what does mental health and harm reduction mean to you?
Sure. Hi. Yes, sorry. Sorry, I'm on campus. So I didn't have time to get home, but mental health to me means taking care of your emotional and psychological well-being. Mental health can be negative at the moment or positive. There are ebbs and flows. And sorry if I got distracted, but yes, that's what mental health means to me. And sorry, the second part of the question was?
It was just mental health or harm reduction. So whichever one like feels most like resonated in your answer. You don't need to answer like both of the questions.
Okay.
So yeah, mental health or harm reduction means to you. And then yeah, why don't we pass it to Bailey?
Hi, everyone. So mental health means to me taking care of your soul and things in your life that are stressing you out. It's very important to remain grounded in your life whenever you can and to pause and take care of yourself. And harm reduction is also really important to me because a lot of places just teach abstinence, which isn't always the best route for people to interact and engage with drugs and mental health as well. So harm reduction and reducing the stigma is really important to me.
So Calpit, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Kalpit. What mental health means to me is taking care of yourself and things that aren't really tangible, but you know they're in there and hold value to you. It's about all of that, and harm reduction would be taking a safer approach and putting yourself first, and that is what it means to me. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then we'll move into our clinical perspectives. So yeah, if Dr. Sari, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Dr. Carol Ann Sari. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I work out here on the West Coast on Vancouver Island. I really like what you guys were saying about taking care of yourself as far as mental health, and I think harm reduction is a part of that. So all of those things that you do to take care of yourself and be in touch with your own thoughts and your feelings is a part of harm reduction. Harm reduction, I think, is not just around substance use is where it gets used the most, but it's really just in life, right? How can you decrease the harms in all sorts of different ways? So there you
go. Awesome, thank you. And Megan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan. I'm also here participating from Victoria on the South Island, Vancouver Island. And in my role, harm reduction is really an opportunity. It's an opportunity to discuss what's important for all of the youth that we work with. It's a chance to look at goals and, goals related to substance use, goals related to sort of mental health, and then to find areas to mitigate risk and negative consequences of things that they related to use.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for those intros. And without further ado, I suppose we can get into the questions. And so the first questions that I have, the way that we're going to sort of run this is I'll have questions that are aimed a bit towards our lived experience panelists, and then questions that are aimed a little bit more towards our experts. And we're just aiming to have just a nice conversation. And so my first question is for my panelists here that are our lived experience folks. And that question is, how has your relationship with cannabis changed since having an experience of psychosis or like a negative trip? And then, yeah, if whoever wants to jump in, and not everyone needs to feel pushed or pressured to answer every question, but if you would like to, absolutely.
I can answer first, if that's all right. My experience with having a very bad trip, which at the time I had no idea what it was, and I thought that I was developing psychosis. It was actually my first time using cannabis, so I just avoided it for years and years after that, which has kind of been rare when meeting people. I haven't met a lot of people who they were open to using it and seeing the positives, and then had such a bad experience the first time that they just steered clear for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like especially post legalization, there's such a normalization that it can be hard to like talk to people and have conversations when your experiences have been like less than positive. Definitely. Kalpit, did you have something?
Yeah, much like also um, when I didn't have a good experience with cannabis, when I experienced psychosis, I tried to stay away from cannabis. And it because it was always that risk for me that what if I go back into that phase of my life where it's really troublesome for me, and I'm hearing voices again and having the delusions or the paranoia. So it's I weighed the pros and cons and decided not to uh, consume cannabis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that is such a huge part of harm reduction as well, is like that personal risk assessment. And like sometimes the risk is something that you're not comfortable with, or sometimes it is not compatible with like where you are in your life at that time. And I think that that is something that is so part of the conversation in harm reduction, is like it is also okay that if the harm reduction for you is abstinence, right? Like that is also a totally fine option. Bailey?
So, like Cal put, since my episode of Psychosis, I actually abstained from cannabis. It's been over a year now, and it's definitely really hard when everywhere you look there is a cannabis shop, around schools, around my house. It's very prevalent. I still have like a great support system around me, which is awesome. That helps me abstain from cannabis, and mentor at my early psychosis intervention clinic that are really helpful with battling the cravings and any lingering feelings I have around cannabis.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you have that support available to you, Elsa.
Sorry, I just wanted to add that yes, that support system is really important. And in my case, as someone who had a bad trip as opposed to psychosis, once I found more resources and I learned more about cannabis and found a group of people that I could talk openly about it with, and learned about safer ways. I did try using it again, and I had a better experience. And then again, I had a really bad trip, and I'm not sure if my body just like doesn't tolerate as much as most people. But now I'm choosing to abstain as well. And Keith just put in the chat a little like video that I made in the summer about that experience, if anyone wants to check that out.
Well, thank you, folks, for sharing your experience. I think we will swap over first now to a question for our two sort of clinical perspectives. And this one is a little bit more aimed towards the differentiation between a bad trip and psychosis symptoms. So when you have individuals coming into your program presenting with psychosis symptoms, or who have experienced maybe a negative like cannabis interaction, how do you differentiate the difference, and how does that care change with that difference?
Okay, well, maybe Megan and I will just go back and forth. So first of all, we work at an early psychosis intervention program. So we end up seeing a lot of young people who've experienced psychosis from whatever reason. I mean, it's not always about schizophrenia or a psychotic illness. There's lots of things that can happen that lead to people having a psychotic experience. So first of all, I wanted to say that the choices that all of you guys made, I think were really wise. First of all, when you said, you know what, I tried this and it wasn't what I expected, and I felt like this was not right, like I felt psychotic, to say maybe this isn't the right thing for me. I think that's a wise decision. Right? I've worked with a lot of young people over the years who have tried cannabis and have gotten really anxious, or they've gotten paranoid or psychotic. And what we know is that everybody has a vulnerability for psychosis. We don't know what your vulnerability is. We all have some risk, right? Your risk could be infinitesimally small or could be quite big. Sometimes it depends on your family history or other experiences that you've had in your life, like early childhood experiences or adverse experiences. So when I've heard people tell me these stories of the first time or one of the early times when they've tried psychosis and or when they've tried marijuana and they have these experiences, I almost feel like it's your brain's telling you that, you know what, this isn't a good thing for you. Because we know that people have a risk for developing psychosis, and marijuana can cause people to get psychotic. So if you're having those early experiences, I mean, I tell people, think of it like it's an allergy. You know, I know that there are cannabis stores everywhere, but for a lot of people, there are strawberries everywhere, or there's chocolate everywhere, and they just have to say, you know what? I can't go there because I know what the results are going to be. You know, for some it's anaphylaxis, right? But for other people it could be psychosis. Now here's that other question, and I've talked a lot, so maybe I'll let Megan answer. What's the difference between a bad trip and psychosis? Can you tell the difference between a bad trip and psychosis?
Well, I think Elsa, you said this really nicely. Like, you know, when you were experiencing that, you really felt like you were having psychosis. And I think in the moment, it's really hard to tell the difference, you know. So it can be about, you know, those symptoms of anxiety and paranoia and those types of things in the moment, and they can be really distressing. But so the difference, I think, comes when the effects of the cannabis wear off and you can sort of feel like you're more connected to reality again. So yeah, with psychosis, those things would persist. You would also experience things like hallucinations, delusions, and sometimes you know, disorganized thinking and things like that.
Yeah. And I think people can have brief psychotic experiences. So there's not even a time limit that has to be attached to psychosis either. It's not like, well, if you had this for 3 hours, then it was psychosis. Otherwise, it was just a bad trip. A bad trip sometimes is called substance-induced psychosis. So it can be identical. Like it just kind of is a matter of where did it come from? Is it related to this drug? And then when the drug is out of your system, will it go away? Maybe, maybe not. And even if it does go away, does that mean you didn't have psychosis? Not necessarily. It could be that it came on because of that drug. It went away, but if you use that drug again, it's going to come back. And one of the risks is if you continue to use that drug, and I've seen it with other patients, it stops going away. And then it becomes more of a chronic thing. So those are the risks that people take by continuing to use something that has made them psychotic in the past. Your future is often kind of very much dependent on what you've experienced in the past. So if you've had psychosis in the past, you're more likely to get it again in the future. And if you knew it was associated, then you think, well, why would I do this again? Because the most likelihood is that it's going to come back again. And what you really hope is it doesn't get to the point where it's not going away. And then that you need to then reach out and get additional supports, and, because you've kind of lost control of it. It's no longer just tethered to the marijuana.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, both of you. I think especially now I've seen a lot of the conversation around psychosis, and especially like substance related psychosis episodes, is how psychosis is like less of a black and white and more, it's like a spectrum, and how this like experience is not necessarily, it's not either like you were in psychosis or you weren't. It's like it can be kind of a fluxing state. And yeah, it's super, super great to hear like everyone that is on the panel, how like you've taken those experiences and like made decisions for yourself. Like I love hearing the range that you guys of like ways that you've dealt with that. Our next question, all three of our panelists have experience within like post-secondary, most either as like current students or graduates. And so one of the things that we wanted to touch on was how your experiences in the post-secondary system, in ways that has either prepared you or not prepared you for the realities of cannabis use, what kind of messaging you were seeing on your campuses, things like that, and how that kind of like felt like it tied into your maybe negative experience with cannabis.
In my experience, I was in school for psychology. I went to university, and we did discuss the endocannabinoid system, but we really didn't talk about the links and the possible risks between cannabis and psychosis. We talked about different substances and substance use, but we never, and what it does to the brain, what it does to the body. But we never discussed any of the adverse effects that can come from cannabis use, especially prolonged use. And I thought it was kind of an odd juxtaposition when a lot of the students that were in my program were cannabis users. I've seen a lot of them use on campus as well. So I really think that they could have done a better job with not talking about abstinence, but at least talking about safe ways to engage in cannabis use. And they could also have done a greater part in reducing stigma around cannabis use, which would have helped, I think, a lot of the students who were going through university at the time.
For me, when I was in university, when I started university is when cannabis just got legalized. So there was not really a lot of information that you could see about it. And by the time, I guess, after 2 or 3 years, when people really started, I guess, talking about it on my campus, was around the time when I experienced psychosis, and that went on for about 2 years or so. So um, it was. I'm not sure if I just noticed it more then because I was experiencing psychosis. But I would say things did pick up in my university after a couple of years of it being legalized.
Um, I agree. I when I started university, I didn't hear anything about cannabis or cannabis use and the effects. Um, there were just these signs that said not to smoke on campus, including vaping, cannabis, and cigarettes. And I'm a psychology major as well, so I found that really interesting. That I think only in one class, the only reason it was brought up is because we were going over different mental health disorders and we came up to schizophrenia. And just very briefly, they mentioned that about the link, and that was it. But also, I actually started, I found the Cannabis and Mental Health Project through a practicum placement with my school, and through them, that's where most of my education came from. And now I'm part of the Youth Action Committee, and we do tabling at the university and events, and that's where I see most of the information coming from. But I think that it's really important that there is that there now.
Through tabling and like chatting with folks on campuses, have you felt like the sort of like general literacy around cannabis has increased since like you sort of started doing this, or are you still running into a lot of folks that are like really, really new to the conversation?
It's definitely increased. I also do think that that's because of the time that all three of us started university, and it was just around the time of legalization.
Yeah, absolutely. I was a university student like 2 years before, and then legalization, and then 2 years after. And I feel like right near the end of that time, it was like almost 2 years too late. Like there was this almost a little bit of like a lag in resources and availability post legalization. And then also with cannabis use a lot of times increasing for folks during post-secondary, like that, I think is a huge spot that people get a little bit lost in the sauce, so to say.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially like first years and stuff. And I think there are some universities that are starting to recognize that, and there's a lot more like first year programming specifically around cannabis and substance use, because it's sometimes the first time people have been like out of the house, and it's a great opportunity for people to get into some like sticky situations just because they don't know or the resources weren't available to them. And so for our next question, thank you guys for that. We'll pass it back to our medical professionals. And this is also a question that kind of links back to legalization. How do you feel like the academic conversation and like clinical conversation has changed around the links between cannabis and psychosis since 2018, when cannabis was legalized?
I guess I would say for me, it sounds, Hunter, a little bit similar to your experience in that there did seem to be a bit of a lack of information for a period of time right before legalization, or specifically about negative impacts of cannabis. And it seems that now it seems it's much easier to access really useful and really well-researched information. And so I think that it's great. It really helps to have those conversations really early.
Yeah, and Hunter, I guess I would add, when you're saying three of you guys have had experiences in post-secondary. Megan and I have too. We've been in post-secondary, I'll let you know. And there was no talk about any of this when I was in school. So probably, okay, I'm going to date myself now. Like 20 years ago, I was presenting grand rounds at as a resident in psychiatry, and I decided to do it on psychosis and marijuana because I was working on a unit with all these young guys who were having psychosis associated with marijuana, and I hadn't read anything about that. So I thought that was interesting, so I started to look it up, and I found research papers from 1970 that were showing the link between psychosis and marijuana. So it had gone back, years and years. So this link was well known for a long time in the research field, right? But there was a difference then, is that the concentration of the marijuana was really low. So we're talking like 1%, 2% THC in your products. And still some people were getting psychotic. So to me, that said, there are some people who have a real vulnerability. And so even at the really low percentages, they were getting psychotic. So then fast forward all this time, and we're getting more and more people as the concentrations were getting higher. So for a while before legalization, there was a big push for the medicalization of marijuana, if you recall, right? People wanting it to be prescribed by physicians who were feeling really out of their depth because of all the risks that had not been really researched. When something's illegal, it's hard to actually get the funding to do research and actually, you know, get people into research studies and give them marijuana because it's illegal. We can't have this anyways. So one of the things that's changed, I think, now that it's legalized is there's a lot more research going on, and we're getting a lot more information about what's happening to young people and to their brains and to their development. So I'm seeing a lot more about what happens like prenatally from a child who's exposed, in utero from early ages, all throughout their lifespan. So I think it's fascinating. I'm also seeing a lot of changes in the fact that we're talking as a community about um, how we're addressing substance use, not just around cannabis, but all substance use. We now have a Canadian Academy for Addiction Psychiatrists. So doctors who specifically are looking at this field. So I think there's been a lot of change, and it's been really a positive one, although it also came as a necessary one because of the increased potency of substance use, which is kind of a double-edged sword there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that that research from the 1970s was available to you at the time, because that was sort of also timed with like the psychedelic renaissance, and then with the new like classification of substances being illegal, especially in the US, that really changed the field of substance use research for a really long time. And I think that we're now just finally like getting a little bit back into being able to do that research. And I think it's also really interesting that in Canada, this is kind of a first of its kind ability to do sort of like a long population study of like a really, really big sample size of cannabis use and like instances of psychosis in ERs and stuff. And so it's a really interesting and new time. And I know even there's just a little bit of research that has just come out in the last like month or so about population sample size and psychosis and things. And there's a couple of research papers that we've talked about a little bit as a group that will also be linked in that resource PDF for folks that is like very, very new current research on cannabis and psychosis in Canada specifically. So yeah, I really encourage you to look into that. And yeah, it's a really good example of how like criminalization also really limits our ability to know the actual like negative and positive effects of substance use, because we aren't able to do research when things are criminalized. So yeah, it's thank you for that. Our next question. Sorry, I'm back on. Sorry, my dog is like screaming in the background, so I'm trying to like pause between barking. So our next question, I'll pass it back to our lived experience folks. And this one is a little bit about your experience and like interacting with the system of mental health and like post-secondary and whatnot. What do you wish service providers, be that medical professionals, social workers, anyone you interact with, and the public as well, knew about people who have experienced a bad trip or psychosis episode related to cannabis?
In general, I just wish that medical professionals were more open to discussing cannabis use or any substance use, because, well, in my case, as someone who struggled a lot with anxiety and depression in my youth and during school, with that added stress, I was looking to cannabis as a way to reduce all of that. And I thought about asking the doctor, but then there's just also this shame surrounding it. And I think it would be very helpful to a lot of people if they felt safer with speaking to their doctors and other healthcare professionals to see what's right for them and ask questions about how to use safely. Because in my case, I didn't have anyone to ask at that time, and I did like everything you could do wrong.
So my experience in post-secondary, I really wish that there was cannabis education that didn't just revolve around abstinence. I would love them to provide some healthy alternatives to using cannabis and maybe reducing the stigma around cannabis use so that it can be talked about in classrooms within the curriculum and like just talked about peer to peer. I also really think that, like what Elsa said, the medical professionals should be more open to it. I would love for a medical professional such as my family doctor to be well versed in cannabis use and the risks of cannabis as well, so that they can advise me, especially if someone has genetic predispositions to psychosis or negative effects of cannabis, or history of psychosis or a history of schizophrenia or bipolar. It would also be beneficial for them not to rush to a diagnosis so quickly. Maybe think about the effects of the cannabis on the psychosis as well. So not just diagnosing them with a condition.
Yeah, I also think that I not to like disregard cannabis's sort of role when you experience psychosis, but I wish that um my caretakers are like the team that was there to help me in my sort of journey also sort of gave importance and value to other things, such as just how is the person doing socially, and uh, sleep or anything, any other things. Like, I'm not trying to say that cannabis's role is not there, but I also feel that um, it, a little bit more, if not equal importance, should be given to other aspects that can play a role in someone experiencing a psychotic episode.
Yes, absolutely. It's like it needs to be a holistic conversation, definitely. And I think that having like greater literacy too for folks like about the risk factors for psychosis and also the ways that we can like mitigate those risks. I think being able to, so that folks, like you said, Bailey, you can have more frank conversations with providers about whether this is like a choice that would be good for you or not. And then yeah, like addressing the whole person as well. And I know, having had conversations with folks that have interacted with the mental health and substance use system, like a lot of the times the like that message that like there is also a lot of other things going along on alongside the substance use, I think will also make people feel safer to have those conversations about it as well. All right, so this has been so lovely. We'll go back to our researcher clinical perspective here. I wanted to touch on prevention a bit, and then we'll wrap it up with a final question for our lived experience folks after. But for when discussing the links between cannabis and psychosis, it is important to discuss prevention and risk reduction. What strategies do you recommend for folks that are accessing your services to prevent adverse experiences with cannabis?
So it was really nice to hear all of your suggestions for healthcare professionals. That was really useful perspective. And I think that some of those things are just so, I mean, they're all just so important to include in any recommendations for our youth. So certainly we're trying to start the conversation really early and make sure that, you know, it's just it's an open conversation that people feel comfortable talking about. And making sure that we're including, you know, individual risk factors and things like that. So, you know, looking at the whole person and really paying attention to the things, because those things will influence the recommendations that we have. So many of the recommendations, you know, you'll all be aware of, but yeah, I mean, are really based on some of those risk factors. So, you know, people have a family history of psychosis, a family history or a personal history of psychosis, a personal history of adverse childhood experiences, then, you know, one of the recommendations may be abstinence. So we are gonna, you know, that will be part of the conversation, but it won't be the whole conversation. And so, yeah, we like to sort of have the conversation and make sure that we're listening to what's important for each of the youth and see where they're at with their substance use and what their goals are and what they'd like to do, what their values are, and then make some come up with some strategies from there. So that can include decreasing the potency of the cannabis that they're using, decreasing the frequency of the cannabis that they're using. So sometimes we do know that greater than weekly cannabis use can increase your risk of psychosis. And so, supporting people to find alternate strategies other ways to sort of manage whatever need the cannabis is sort of meeting for people. Yeah, Caroline?
Yeah, I think what Megan's getting at is that there's kind of really two parts of risk. One is your individual risk, the risk that you personally carry from your own experiences, your own history. And then there's some risk that comes from the substance use and that interaction with your risk. So I agree, and for people who are making that decision whether or not to even try marijuana at the first. So there is that history, and there's also your age, because the earlier you start to introduce marijuana into your brain, the greater the risk is. And you can almost think of it like I'm building a house. So do I want to put the marijuana in at the foundation, which could have a big impact on how the whole house gets built, or maybe I want to wait until the house is up and fully developed and then maybe think about it. Yeah, because it can have a real devastating effect the earlier you try it. So, we've seen kids who are 9 and 10 starting to use marijuana. It has a bigger impact because their brain is even that much less mature at that time. I also agree that the drug itself, with the potency, the frequency, I would recommend people don't mix it with other things because then it can get really confusing as to what's actually happening. I think if you're going to be trying it and you've had bad experiences, think about where your headspace is in that moment. What we know with a lot of substances is they can intensify whatever things that are going on for you right in that moment. So if you're already upset, if you're already anxious, it could make that worse. I know a lot of people go in and use these things thinking it's going to help. And that's another piece I think people need to think about is like, we can see a difference as far as whether someone ends up having difficulty with a substance based on why they're using it. If this is for social related use versus kind of a needs-based use. So if we're using it for sleep, for appetite, for anger, for mood, for focus, for all of these other things, those are ones that often led people to use it more than that once a week, more than just in a moment when I'm with some friends in a social setting. And that increases the risk that people will not only become more dependent on it, but then that increases the frequency, which with that comes an increased risk of psychosis. So kind of thinking a little bit about what is it that I'm using this for? What do I like it for? What don't I like about this? Yeah, and I think in those moments, if you're going to be trying it, if you have other people around you so that they can be that kind of that touchstone for you. So if something's happening and you're feeling anxious or scared, then you have some people that you trust around you who might be able to help you through that experience and get help if you need it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that like set and setting is something that you really touched on of like, where are you? Who are you with? Where are you? How are you feeling in that moment? Like doing that just sort of like environmental and body scan can be such a huge help for folks of like, is today the day for this? And it's okay if it's not. And it's okay if it is as well. And I know that even for myself, like substances that I have used many, many, many times, you come into a different environment and you're like, that was not what it's usually like. And it's like very important to be mindful of those things. So our last question I'm going to give to our lived experience folks, but with that, for anyone who is watching, and if you've gathered any questions throughout the course of this conversation, super encourage you, throw some in the chat. We've just got one more like sort of prescriptive question for our panelists, and then after that, we can open it up to conversation. So yeah, if you have anything brewing right now, don't be afraid, throw it into the chat. And so my last question for panelists here is a little bit more open-ended, but what would you like to share with other folks about your experience, about other young folks specifically, about your experience? And if you don't have anything to share there, what would you, is something that you would like to tell your younger self?
So something I would love to tell the youth and younger folks and myself as well is that just because cannabis is legalized doesn't mean that it's generally safe for everybody. You don't have to have underlying conditions for it to become a problem for you, and you can become dependent on it as well. I would also love to mention that the potency is very, very strong in newer cannabis as opposed to back in the day, as well as I know vaping THC is very popular and it's like very easy to use. It's kind of one of the things I used to justify my use was that it's not smoking, it's not burning my lungs, it's scentless, it's easy to hit anywhere. It was very easy to just discreetly use and kind of hide my cannabis use, like the frequency, from everybody as well. So I would definitely mention that to my younger self, is that it's not always a healthier alternative, especially if you're using it more often than you would flower or a bong perhaps, or another method of ingesting cannabis. That's what I would love to tell them.
I agree with all of those points. And also something else that I would say to youth is that it's okay to listen to your body and to your experience. And if something feels wrong, even if it is something that is legal and a lot of people around you are doing, and in my case, I was told that happens. It's just a bad trip. I'm glad that I listened to my body, and it's something that I decided not to continue using, especially now learning this. I just heard from Dr. Sari, and just knowing that there isn't as much of a distinction between a bad trip and psychosis as I would have thought. And I did know that having one experience with psychosis and continuing to use could lead to it lasting longer, which is, it's a scary experience. And just education is really important so you can make safe decisions for yourself and avoid unwanted outcomes.
Yeah, I would just say what Dr. Sari said about cannabis, like to my younger self, to the youth, that what does it do for you? You know, how what good will come out of it, but what's the loss that you can face from it? What's the good if you don't do it, and what's the loss if you don't do it? You know, just being aware about your decision, I think, is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that when we've been doing outreach with Get Sensible, is like when we are talking to folks about like, you know, we have a zine that we've made that is about like preventing greening out, which is like just another sort of way to describe a bad trip potentially. And I think that something that has been a trend that we've seen is like people not even is that resources, like if it does go poorly, like what you should do after that. And so I think conversations like this of like you, Elsa, you were like, that was not for me. And then talking about, you know, if you've had a negative experience with cannabis, like how should you proceed after that? I think like those are things that are a little bit missing sometimes because these things do happen to folks. And so it's like we can get them with the harm reduction beforehand, like clean your bong, set and setting, all of those things. But it's like, what if it didn't work? And I think that more conversation around like, is cannabis for you is also really, really valuable, because I think it's okay to tell people that it isn't. And in now that we've like been, we're out of legalization, about 5 years now, it's okay to start talking about like, it is something that is forever, it can be for you, but it also is okay if it isn't. And I think that there's a need for resources for people that have maybe had a negative experience and how to proceed after that. Oh, this is something I was literally just saying. So Kira has a question for everyone. Kira has said, so we talk a lot about the before and during component. However, what would you like people to know that have already had something that has already happened to them? I think we were kind of just talking about that. Like, it's good to do that scan of like, is this something that is for you? And then Kira, it says, yeah, exactly same question. Also curious about comments regarding the stigmatization of people who've experienced psychosis. So for folks who have experienced psychosis, Kira, I'm not sure like what, you can even turn your audio on, like what like are you asking about like the psychosis stigma that they've experienced, or just like
Well, no, I'm wondering about like, let's say, like this has happened to you and you like are often probably scared and just like nervous about your future, and like, is this going to happen again? Even like without cannabis, is like, what does my life look like post um a cannabis induced episode of psychosis, or just like psychosis in general? That's more what I was getting to with the idea of stigmatization of people who've experienced psychosis, is that I think a lot of the conversation ends at like, well, like, don't smoke weed because you're gonna experience psychosis and then your life is gonna be over. And I would love to hear what folks have to say about like, okay, but what happens if that is the case? Like, what does the future after that look like for folks?
Megan, I think that's something for you and I to answer. What does this
Sure.
look like afterward? Because I think it's really scary when people have psychosis, right? And people go to their friends and their friends have their experiences and they talk about it. And sometimes parents are helpful, not always. If you have a physician, if you have an NP, if you have somebody that you can talk to about that, somebody at like a student health at your school, somebody who has some experience, I think that's a great place to start to find out and talk to somebody and let them know about some of your worries. Because I think those are real life worries. Like once you've had it, it's like, now what? Is this going to come back? And I can't say 100% that it won't. Because because we know that people have a vulnerability, and it could be that they do have a vulnerability to a mood disorder or a psychotic illness, and that might still present itself. The age of onset, the typical age of onset for these kind of disorders are in your late teens and early 20s. So I don't know, but we also know that we have these programs that are out here to support young people and help them kind of live their lives to the utmost that they can, right? Megan, did you have some more to add?
Well, and just that we have good treatment for psychosis. So, there is help out there. And we have, a lot of different treatments too, like not just, medication is one part of it. But then there's also, CBT for psychosis, and, there's cognitive remediation and those types of things. So there's a lot of help out there, and people recover from psychosis.
I guess that all three of us are good examples that your life is not over afterwards.
I saw Heath put in the chat, they would love to hear our perspective on this, and I kind of had an answer. I know that the future might seem a little bit daunting and scary after psychosis. It might be unsure. It might have thrown you right off your track. I would say that there's definitely a lot of shame and guilt that surrounds you afterwards of your psychosis, especially if it's cannabis induced, because you think, this is my fault. How come some people can smoke so much more than me or use more cannabis than me and it doesn't happen to them? And how come it happened to me? Definitely, I would say that there's a lot of shame and guilt that surrounds it, but you can get over it with just reminding yourself that you're moving forward and just putting it kind of in the past and changing your life up.
I think a lot of people also don't really understand how scary it is when it does happen to you. So people will say, "Oh, I'm sure it was nothing. Here, just try it again." And you have to be very clear, like you don't understand what that was like, and it was not something I'd want to go through again. Yeah. So that
Yeah,
that also is part of that education of other people, I guess.
that's a huge thing, especially with cannabis being something that is so common and seen as generally safe for most people. One of the harder experiences for me after is just having to keep explaining, no, I don't want to try. And I also still get like anxiety or sort of fear about just being exposed to secondhand smoke because there's not a lot of research on that at all. Yeah.
I totally agree also. Like when I'm in a room or like just outside somewhere and I can see someone smoking and I can smell the cannabis, I get scared. Like, what if just that secondhand smoke triggers an episode or something, and then that is very scary for me as well. So I understand sometimes what it feels like. I think Heath has the hand up.
Oh my God, Kelpit, thanks for calling on me. I have a question, but I wanted to say it out loud. I also wanted to thank, I mean, everyone on the panel, like both the clinical perspectives and like especially the lived experience perspectives. I mean, the people on the panel know that I also am someone who had a cannabis-induced psychosis, and I've met many of you through this work that we are all doing now. And I also think just how much of an isolating experience it can be. And so like the peer support and connection of seeing other people that have gone through it, recognizing it can be different. It's just so refreshing. And it's just so always nice to hear people talk about it with such like self-compassion and compassion for each other. Um, One of the things I guess, I mean, we talked about how like it can be very distressing. I think that's something that I always am trying to balance in my work is like not further stigmatizing or like fear mongering around like psychosis, but also recognizing that it can be like a very scary experience for people. And I don't know if that's even as much of the question as just like something that like is coming to me. The thing that I think I'm more curious about is that many of you have mentioned that you have switched to like you've abstained from cannabis because of your experience. And I was in the camp of people who did not and who kept smoking weed. Like I had a psychotic episode and then I just kept smoking weed. And like sometimes it didn't agree, sometimes it did. But I guess I'm curious. I eventually did like slow down and like moderate my use more, but I have a lot of friends now that are coming to me as we're getting older that are like, I want to stop smoking weed and I don't know how. I know you've mentioned like people not taking it so seriously because like it's just weed or whatever. But I'm curious like if you had other struggles when it came to like quitting weed or like if it was like difficult or if like you have tips, I guess, for people who are trying to use less or quit.
I can speak to this one a little bit. I know that I'm not a panelist, but I and I think like as someone who has been a long time cannabis user, and I do have like a bit of a more like medical relationship to cannabis. But that being said, there are times in life where your use of the substance maybe has now outbalanced its benefits. And I think that honestly, the greatest, biggest support, both like for myself and also folks that I have talked to or like been in community with that have been trying to decrease their use, is like the biggest thing is community. So the first place that I always send people, honestly, is there's some really, really great communities on Reddit for folks that are trying to do like tolerance breaks or even just fully abstain. One of them that I love is called r/petioles. And that one essentially is like a community of people that are all either abstaining from cannabis or in the middle of an active like short period of abstinence. I also, when I was doing a tolerance break, joined a Discord server of folks that were also doing a tolerance break at that same time. And I think that that was also really valuable. So those, like, if you don't have that community like in person necessarily, like maybe the people around you are still using and aren't looking to change their relationship with their use, like looking to community online, because there are always people that are in a period of abstinence or are going to think about engaging in one. And I think that being able to talk to people about like what you're experiencing, the things that they're experiencing, like it makes it feel a little bit more manageable. There's also a really good resource called the Tolerance Break Guide from the University of Vermont. That is like a 3-week sort of prescriptive, like you're taking a break from cannabis, and that can be used as like a initiation into a longer period of abstinence or just that period. That essentially gives like a day-by-day breakdown of things to work on, and it kind of looks into like a psychosocial, like working on your sleep, working on your eating, working on your exercise, of like all these things that maybe cannabis has like made easier for you and now you're taking away, so you're having issues with appetite. And I've found that super valuable, and other folks have as well. So yeah, if anybody else wants to talk on that. But yeah, I feel like the community connection part of people that are also experiencing the same thing is like super, super key.
I find what really helps me is sort of reminding myself the reason why I abstained from cannabis. Just reminding myself all the consequences of my psychosis and things that I'm still healing from, like asking myself, is it worth it? And kind of weighing out the pros and cons. Even writing it down helps sometimes. And when it gets really bad, if I have intense cravings, like sometimes I'll have dreams about cannabis use. I have like a lot of dreams. I tell myself, next year, maybe next year you can try it. And then hopefully by that point next year, I have no interest in trying it again, or I can just put it off another year, and just that helps me abstain.
I think that I personally wouldn't be the best person to answer that question, because that was my first time and I was done. And then I tried like 3 times after, and the third time was bad again. And I guess I didn't have enough experiences to feel the positives, even though I heard so many people talking about them. So for me, it was easier to just be like, nope, it's okay. It's not for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you, folks, for that. I see that we are just about at time. It's gone by so quickly. I know that Heath just put a question from clinicians, but we might have to do that one. Might have to address that one in our like post event, just because I think it's a little bit of a bigger one about CBD. But I did see that there was a message in here that I can quickly just respond to in the way that Get Sensible generally does, about whether greening out is the same as a bad trip. And essentially, I feel like those two things are one and the same. I think greening out is more of just like a community lexicon in cannabis, but essentially the results are the same. A lot of times people are feeling disoriented. They maybe have unpleasant physical symptoms, paranoia, anxiety, all of those things. So I think that greening out more than anything is just, it's more just like community language and slang, but like a bad trip physically probably would look the same thing. And we just kind of define greening out by anything that was just like an unpleasant physical or emotional experience for someone after they've used. And then, yeah, we do have a guide to not greening out with Get Sensible, but that could also be called the guide to not having a bad trip. Like it's essentially the same thing. So yeah, with that, I think that that is our time. If we can put the little link, the last page of the slides in, let me see if it lets me. Still can't share my thing. So yeah, if Michaela or Carm want to put the just last page of our slides up just quickly, that has a little link tree in it that so you can scan this and it'll take you to some of the, this is a feedback little QR code. So would love if anyone would love to give a little bit of feedback about the workshop, if it was valuable for you. And then all of the resources that we've mentioned are available, both Cannabis and Mental Health and Get Sensible on socials. And then there will also be a resource PDF sent out that just has a bunch of links to like relevant research and organizations that are doing work around cannabis and psychosis. And yeah, any questions, please reach out to Cannabis and Mental Health. I see that there's one talking about cool ways to get involved with Get Sensible and stuff. And yeah, send all that stuff to Cannabis and Mental Health and they will get you connected. And yeah, thank you so much to everyone for attending. That was wonderful. And if you have any questions beyond this that you weren't able to get answered, please email them to Cannabis and Mental Health. And in our sort of post event, when we go to post this recording, we will also put together a little document that has any of the questions that haven't been answered. So yes, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. That was wonderful.